This month of November is traditionally a season for remembrance. During its darkening days, we have All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, the reminder of a dark past in Bonfire Night. And then there's Remembrance Sunday, inviting us to remember those lost to us in times of war and in times of peace. As we have wandered city streets and parks and countryside this month, especially since the clocks went back and nights grew longer and colder, we've seen the colours of the trees changing, the fallen leaves gathering on the pavements and scattering on the grass, drifting into piles at our church and garden gates. And there's a sombre beauty, a wistful melancholy about it all. This reflection and its subsequent discussion follow the theme of remembrance and explores the weight of grief that many of us experience at this time of year, alongside the hope of resurrection that is the cornerstone of our faith. But please be sensitive to your own feelings. If now is not the right time to be watching a video like this, please feel free to lay it aside and perhaps come back at another time.
Leaves falling. The yellowed leaves are falling from the old ash tree, dancing in the wind. Watching the leaves fall slowly in ones, twos, threes, then sudden billowing wind-blown clouds softly mantling the garden. I love this time of year, coming towards its end and winter sleep, the natural way of things. Soon twigs and branches will be bare, skeletal beauty exposed, simply a perch for birds and not a hiding place. An undressing, disrobing, gentle revelation with nothing to fear. Thus may it ever be, and also with me. For all those of us who have lost people we love and still miss them, no matter how long ago they died, this time of year can bring an opportunity to remember them, perhaps through a special service in a church or hospital chapel setting, with a simple liturgy like the one we used recently, Rosemary for Remembrance. Some cultures commemorate those who have died in other ways, like Dia de los Muertos. Some of us have been bereaved relatively recently, of course, and there may still be a real sharpness and aching pain to our sense of loss. We may still be facing those firsts without our loved ones, birthdays, wedding anniversaries, Christmas, the day they were taken into hospital or we saw them for the last time, the day they died, the day we laid their earthly bodies to rest, or buried or scattered their ashes in some special place full of shared memories. There's no one way or right way to grieve. We each feel and cope with loss differently. It's part of being human, as natural a part of living as death itself. This season of remembrance is also the time when we rightly remember and honour all those who have given their lives for their country in conflict, including both world wars and the many more localised conflicts since, like those in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of us will have been, perhaps still are, members of the armed forces ourselves, or have close relatives who have served or are still serving, or may be doing a tour of duty as peacekeepers in other troubled parts of the world. The terrible human cost of war is not limited to those killed, of course. So many sustain life-changing injuries, whether physical or mental and emotional. And the cost isn't limited to those who are active combatants either. Personally, I find it incredibly hard to get my head round some of the numbers. The total number of deaths in the First World War includes about 10 million military personnel, but around 7 million civilians also lost their lives, and overall 20 million people were wounded or injured. World War II fatality statistics are even more horrific, with estimates of total dead ranging from 50 million to more than 80 million. This higher figure, including 50 to 55 million civilians, includes deaths from war-related disease and from famine. Yet still, we go to war. Silence by Malcolm Guite. November pierces with its bleak remembrance of all the bitterness and waste of war. Our silence tries but fails to make a semblance of that lost peace they thought worth fighting for. Our silence seethes instead with wraiths and whispers and all the restless rumour of new wars. The shells are falling all around our vespers. No moment is unscarred. There is no pause. In every instant, blooded innocence falls to the weary earth. And whilst we stand, quiescence ends again in acquiescence, and Abel's blood still cries in every land. One silence only might redeem that blood, only the silence of a dying God. The latest conservative estimates from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, suggests that as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or events seriously disturbing public order, there are now a staggering 122.6 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, of whom almost 46.5 million are refugees. At the end of 2023, 40% of all refugees were children under the age of 18, and 2 million of those children were born as refugees. Tragically, many current conflicts around the world have actually been going on for decades, including both the Russia-Ukraine and Palestinian-Israeli conflicts. Today, at a time when there seems to be a danger of even further escalation, there are 6.1 million Ukrainian refugees and nearly 7 million Palestinian refugees scattered worldwide. It's just over a year since the brutal Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October 2023 that killed over 1,100 people and in which 251 people were taken hostage. The Israeli military response has killed almost 44,000 Palestinians to date, predominantly women and children. 91,000 people have been injured, and an estimated 1.9 million people among Gaza's population of 2.1 million have been displaced. In Lebanon, since the beginning of October this year, over 3,500 people have already been killed, over 14,000 injured, and in a 2-week period in October, over 700 Palestinians died in violence in the West Bank. The flying of kites has long been symbolic of resistance, freedom, and hope. In March, hundreds of displaced children in Rafah in Gaza made kites and flew them as a symbol of peace in a time of war. Palestinian writer, poet and activist Professor Rafa'at Alaria was haunted by the daily devastation in Gaza and the fear that he and his family would be targeted. A few weeks before his death in an Israeli airstrike almost a year ago, he reposted a poem that he'd originally written in 2011 called If I Must Die. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. In the midst of all that's so appalling in the wider world, I wonder if we can find any resurrection stories, light in the darkness, hope in the midst of despair. One story that has given me hope is that of two bereaved fathers, one Palestinian, one Israeli. Prior to 7th of October 2023, each had lost a young daughter, innocent victims of the long-standing tensions and regular outbreaks of violence between Israel and Gaza. But instead of enmity, a deep friendship and shared longing for peace had been kindled between these two men, and they now work together for peace and reconciliation. I'm also reminded of images in some of the great English artist Sir Stanley Spencer's resurrection paintings. Spencer's lifelong religious faith was deep, if somewhat unconventional, and it found expression in much of his art. He experienced the horrors of the First World War firsthand whilst serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Nearly a decade after the armistice, he was commissioned to paint a series of 16 paintings depicting his wartime memories, which cover the walls of the specially designed Sandham Memorial Chapel at Berkeley, a place which left an indelible impression on me when I first visited as a child. Remarkably, rather than focusing on violence or glorifying heroism and sacrifice, many of Spencer's paintings depict ordinary, everyday scenes of camp life and companionship. But the chapel's centrepiece is the huge 21-foot-high, 17.5-foot wide end wall painting behind the altar, entitled Resurrection of the Soldiers. In the foreground of this extraordinary scene, soldiers climb out from under the rubble of their graves. Some reach out to shake hands with one another, whilst further back in perspective, others present their simple white cross grave markers to the seated figure of the risen Christ. Spencer explained the centrality of the painting like this: I had buried so many people and saw so many bodies that I felt death could not be the end of everything. Resurrection was a recurring theme in Spencer's work throughout his life. One of his best-known paintings, The Resurrection Cookham, is set in the churchyard of his home village in Berkshire. God stands in the church porch behind the seated figure of Jesus cradling a child, whilst Spencer himself, his friends, neighbours and family members are joyfully emerging from their graves. Resurrection is also a thread of hope running through St. Paul's first letter to the Thessalonian church. Paul invites his listeners to encourage one another with the hope that when Jesus comes again, those who have already died will be raised from death, and those who are still alive will together be reunited with Christ and with one another. And so, says Paul, we will be with the Lord forever. As we grieve both for those we have personally loved and lost, and as we grieve for our wounded, warring world, may that be a hope for aching hearts indeed.
So we've just watched a quite moving meditation and reflection on the theme of loss and remembrance and hope and resurrection that you scripted and narrated. And I wondered if we might talk a bit about your own experience of loss and grief as a result of losing your father 18 months ago. And really the central part of my question, I think, is about the grieving process and how it's been for you over those 18 months since your father passed away.
Yes. My dad died in the early spring last year, and died actually very suddenly. I mean, he did have an underlying heart condition, but was not expected to die as suddenly and unexpectedly as he did. So that was quite a shock, I think, for everyone. But from his point of view, it meant that right up until the day before he died, he'd been living life to the full, and enjoying being with friends and discussion groups and voting in the local council elections and just living life very normally up until the day that he was taken into hospital and then died.
So you missed out on that opportunity to say farewell.
Yes, yeah, which was hard, really. But I'm very glad, both from his point of view and my stepmother's point of view, that she was able to be there with him when he died, and to be able to say goodbye to him. I think that for the rest of us, we had to say our goodbyes in different ways, and particularly I think at his funeral service, which didn't happen I think until about a month after he had died.
And I know you've spent a lot of time thinking and reflecting about your dad since then, and I wonder, how has it been for you over the last year and a half? Because I know that many people talk about stages of grief and maybe a spiral, that we keep coming back to the same feelings, but we're in a different place each time we come back. How's your experience been?
Difficult to answer that one. I think to begin with, in those early weeks and months after he died, I spent a lot of time staying with my stepmother, kind of helping her to prepare for my father's funeral, and taking care of all the the practical things that have to happen after somebody has died, the registering of the death. And so can be a very busy time. And in a way that kind of carries you initially. And I think you feel a bit numb. I think, all the kind of normal things of everyday life and perhaps your commitments and things you lay to one side. For at least a little bit of time. I think I found it hard to pray in those kind of early days after he died in the way that I would normally. I would get up very early in the morning. I'd wake up very early in the morning, and then immediately it would kind of hit me again, that sense that my dad was not going to be coming back. And I'd go off and walk for miles kind of along the river or across the fields, and just I suppose grieve for him without words in a way. But then as time went by, I was able to begin to pick up the pieces of a busy life again, and be part of the churches that you were leading at that time again. I can remember my stepmother, though, in those early weeks after he died. I went to church with her for the first time after he died, and I can remember people who had known and loved them both over many years sort of coming up to her very solicitously to sort of ask how she was doing, and her response was, because she's a very kind of stoic, very kind of brave kind of person, as well as can be expected under the circumstances. And she was incredibly brave, but at home, she would talk about him, and we would talk about him. But I think it's, when I visited her earlier this autumn, over a year since he died, she was saying to me that she kind of almost misses him now more than ever. And I've had good friends who lost their son when he was only 30, and that was sort of 6 or 7 years ago now, and I think they would say that actually they miss him more now than ever. But I think there's a kind of a sweetness somehow as mixed in with the grief of the remembering. My dad wasn't perfect, but I do tend to remember many ways in which he was a great blessing in my life, and the things that we talked about, the things that we shared, and so in a way, I as time has gone by, I've almost kind of felt that this last 18 months I've felt closer to my dad than perhaps when he was alive, in that they lived very busy lives, and we would see them perhaps every few months or so, and I'd chat to him on the phone. He was, he didn't kind of talk for a long time on the phone, but maybe I kind of have more conversations with him about things, with that sense that somehow we're still connected in some way. And I know that was something that he believed, that
so he's become part of you somehow.
Yes. And I think that was something that he believed and wrote about, and used some of his words in his funeral service. Well, a lot of his words actually, and that's very comforting, to think of that sense of, even though he's not physically present anymore, and when I go to see my stepmother, he's not going to be the one opening the front door and able to kind of give and receive a hug. There's that sense that somehow we are still connected within God's love. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you did share with your dad was a love for the paintings of Sir Stanley Spencer, which we saw a few of in the video.
Yes. Yeah.
So what was significant about those paintings and his paintings? There were themes of the ordinariness in the middle of horrific war, and there were themes of resurrection and hope. So what was it about those that drew you to include those in the meditation video?
Well, I think that over the last few years, I've been preaching on Remembrance Sunday every year, and been kind of thinking a lot about war and my sort of sense of sadness with the fact that war still seems to kind of be so present in our world. We don't seem to have learned our lesson. And a couple of years ago, when I was thinking about what am I going to say on Remembrance Sunday, the readings that particular year were thinking about the second coming of Christ, and thinking about resurrection and hope. And with everything that was going on in the world, and at that time the war in Ukraine was continuing into its second year, and I was wanting to think about, well, where is the hope in this? And of course now we've the war in Israel and Gaza is into its second year. And suddenly I remembered the chapel at Berkeley and Sir Stanley Spencer's resurrection paintings. And in fact, I remembered that it was my dad who had first taken me, when I was probably a primary school age child, to that chapel, and I'd been very struck by the paintings then, and then revisited the chapel many years later as an adult with my dad and stepmother and my grandmother, who was still alive then. And I'd visited, there's a gallery that exhibits some of Sir Stanley Spencer's paintings in Cookham, which is near where my dad and stepmother lived for many years. So the resurrection Cookham, which we saw in the video, is one of those paintings, as well as the ones from the chapel at Berkeley. So yes, that kind of link came there, and this researching Spencer's kind of memories of the war, and how he had focused less on the kind of horror of war, or kind of glorifying war in any way, but looking at the kind of down to earthness of it in some of the paintings, thinking about what it might be like to wake up in the morning and for war to be at an end, and for it to be peace.
Yes.
Instead, he talks about that in his writings about what inspired the painting of that memorial chapel.
It is extraordinary that even in the midst of all that horror, he was still able to focus on hope and resurrection, and imagine peace and a better time.
Yes.
Even right in the middle of all that trauma.
Yes. And I think that was something that I wanted to hold on to. Where is hope? Where are the resurrection stories in this seemingly endless spiral of doom, in a way that the world seems to be caught up in, and war, after the two world wars, there was that sort of sense of, we've got to learn the lessons from this. We can't keep doing this, after the Holocaust and so on. We can't keep doing this, and yet we do. And I was wanting to somehow find, as Spencer did, the things of hope to hold on to in the midst of
like those kites flying in the sky.
Yeah, the kites flying in the sky as a symbol of hope and of peace, even in the midst of war and despair. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah.
Prayer for the people of all nations at war, adapted from a prayer by Sam Wells. God of peace, your prophet Isaiah promised swords would be turned into plowshares, and your son's mother Mary proclaimed the mighty would be put down and the humble exalted. Visit the peoples of all those parts of the world torn apart by war. Deliver them from fear, violence, attack, injury, destruction, death. And give them courage, solidarity, and help in their hour of vulnerability and sorrow. Turn the hearts of those bent on war and invasion. Strengthen the hand of all seeking to halt conflict, restore order, and pursue justice. And make this moment of peril an occasion for your Holy Spirit to show your world the cost of conflict and our dependence on one another. In Christ our Lord, who went to his death because of our hatred, and rose again because our hatred is never stronger than your indomitable love. Amen. Sanctus by Malcolm Guide. We lie upon the grass on God's good earth and listen to the requiem's intense, long, love-laden keening, calling forth echoes of Eden, blessing every sense with brimming blisses, every death with birth, until all passion passes into praise. I bless the winding paths that brought us here. Bless this day distinct amidst our days. I bless the light, the music-laden air, the music-laden air. I bless the entire